Alrighty, there goes the recording and we can start the webinar. And I always just give it a couple minutes to let people jump on.
I'll just mute myself until it's time.
Sounds good. Hello, everyone. We've slowly let some people in here. I'll give it a second. Woohoo, lots of people. The number is going up. That's exciting. All right. I'll give this slow intro so we let more people in, but we've got 35 people already, so that's exciting. My name is Michaela Harder, and I'm the site supervisor for the Sibley Historic Site. And with us tonight, we have Lacey Perpich-Hedke, and she is going to give us a presentation. First, I'll pull up my PowerPoint here so you guys have something to look at. All right. So, welcome. First, I'll give Lacey's introduction. So, Lacey is an artist, photographer, and she specializes in 19th century process for photography. She's a spiritualist, astrologer, and a librarian in Minneapolis. She runs a project space and shop in South Minneapolis called The Future. And she's been studying and working in antiquated photo processes for over 20 years and studied to be a medium at the Greater Boston Church of Spiritualism. Before I hand it off to her, which I'm super excited to do so because I'm excited to learn about this, just a few housekeeping items. If you haven't done a webinar yet this year, if you're in right now and you can hear us, you're doing great. That's all you've got to do now. We can't see or hear you because it's a webinar, but if you want to interact with us, you can comment in this little chat box, that icon that arrow is pointing to, or if you have a question, you can write it in the question and answer box, the icon that is right there. That'll either be at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. This is a pretty big group. It looks like we have 42 people now. It might keep climbing, but I know we have people from across the country. So if you want to throw in the chat box where you are watching from, that could be fun. And lastly, we're really excited to have you. Thanks for joining us and for your donations. Those really help us keep doing this kind of thing. And this Sibley Historic Site is run by Dakota County Historical Society. We have a museum in South St. Paul, and we also have the Leduc Historic Estate in Hastings, Minnesota. We all three do different things online, and Leduc and the Lashy Museum are partially opened. So you can check out our website there to donate or see what we're doing this year. So I will stop sharing my screen here and mute myself and let Lacey take over.
Hi. I just figured out how to unmute myself. I'm Lacey Perpich-Hedke. I'm going to talk with y'all tonight about Victorian spirit photography. I have a lot of slides to show you, but I am happy to answer any questions that you have during the webinar. So again, you can just throw them in the chat or in the Q&A. And if for some reason I miss it, we're going to have time for Q&A at the end too. I'm just going to share my screen, and Michaela, if you wouldn't mind telling me if you can see it.
Yes, I will. And someone has asked if we can turn on the live transcript. I have not done that before. Do you know how that works, Lacey? I don't know if it's given me an option. I'll keep looking and try to do that live transcript for you, but I apologize if I am not able to find it out. Host should be able to see it under the More tab. My More tab gives me just options to be live. I don't know if it doesn't have that option in the webinar.
I don't know.
Yeah, my More doesn't give me that option, unfortunately. But that is definitely something I can write a note for and make sure we try and do that for next time.
You know, I don't know if this will work,
audios.
but there is something at the bottom of my screen that says, oh, never mind, it's not going to work. Well, there is a slide that says captions, but then when I click on it, it says it's not going to work. So I'm doing this because I feel more comfortable in the 19th century. I am not even a 20th century tech person. So sorry, I can't help you more with that. Well, should I get started?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think it's allowing me to, but
All right.
I'll take off my camera and mute myself, but I'll jump back in if you need any help or if something's going weird. So
Great, thank
enjoy,
you.
everyone.
And I'm realizing that I can't see comments. So if there is something, feel free to butt in and just ask the comment, Michaela.
Sounds good. Will do.
All right. So I have a long slideshow because I feel like looking at pictures is more interesting than looking at a talking head, but we will have time for questions at the end. This is an illustration of a seance, and tonight we're going to talk about the religion of spiritualism and how it overlapped with photography, specifically spirit photography. Before that, I will just tell you a little bit about myself and how I came to both photography and spiritualism. I grew up in Dakota County, and now I live in South Minneapolis on unceded Dakota and Anishinaabe territory. So I have some roots in Dakota County, and I went to the arts high school for photography. It was media then, and then I got my BFA in photography from the Art Institute of Boston, where I learned a lot of 19th century photo processes, which is what I work with now. And at the same time, when I was living in Boston, my roommate's boyfriend's dad was the pastor at the Spiritualist church in Salem, and we started going there once a week and learning about the religion of spiritualism, which is essentially the religion of talking to spirits or dead people. And it was something that I had always been interested in, but I didn't know it was a real religion or an organized religion. And so it was kind of when I was learning about photography, I was also learning about spiritualism, and through spiritualism, I learned about spirit photography. So that is kind of my background. And then once I graduated my undergrad, I started going to the Greater Boston Church of Spiritualism to learn to be a medium and to do the laying on of hands, which is a sort of energy healing similar to Reiki, but it uses spirit energy. And so I've always had an interest in the crossover between photography and spiritualism, which grew up around the same time. Photography was announced to the world in 1839, and spiritualism developed in 1840. In the 1840s. And so both of these things were kind of growing up around the same time. So let's start looking at some slides just to have that little background. I'll talk to you about what spiritualism is. So spiritualism is now an organized religion, and here are their declaration of principles. They say this at every church service. And I can just give you a second to look at this, but the idea is
I'm going to skip in real quick. Lazy, did you click the share? I don't think we quite can see the slides. Right?
Can't see my slides. Did I?
Yeah, mine doesn't show that you're...
Okay, here I go.
There we go. Perfect.
All right, presenting. All right. Here are the declarations of principles. Thank you, Michaela. Yeah. So this is what they would say at almost every spiritualist church gathering. Spiritualism is they consider it a science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life. And they are really into proving that you can communicate with spirits. And so this proof can come through mediumship, or any other sort of proof, and this would be clairvoyance, being able to see or have thought like visions of things in the future, clairaudience, which is hearing voices or messages from spirit. Levitation, there's a kind of idea of like physical mediumship, table tapping, some like Ouija boards would fall under this category. But this Declaration of Principles is kind of lays out what spiritualists believe, so that you can communicate with the dead, that life goes on after you go through the transition that we call death, that we make our happiness or unhappiness. A lot of it's kind of built around the golden rule. And when spiritualists talk about God or the goddess, they talk about infinite intelligence. So you can just think of that as another word for God, or however you interact with God or understand that concept. Let's see. Let me go to my next slide. Okay. And here is the definitions of what a spiritualist is and what a medium is. A spiritualist is one who believes, as part of his or her religion, in the communication between this and the spirit world by means of mediumship, and who endeavors to mold his or her character and conduct in accordance with the highest teachings derived from such communion. A medium is one whose organism is sensitive to vibrations from the spirit world, and through whose instrumentality intelligences in that world are able to convey messages and produce the phenomena of spiritualism. This is Kate and Maggie Fox. And so when we talk about spiritualism before 1848, spiritualism is mentioned in the Bible, although not with that word. The idea of talking to spirits, of course, goes since the beginning of people who have been living and dying and trying to communicate across those boundaries. The idea that the dead can come back is something that has been in every culture, or that we can communicate with spirits has been in cultures across the board. And so this isn't a new idea necessarily, but in 1848, what happens is that these two, Kate and Maggie Fox, who lived in Hydesville, New York, which is not too far from Rochester, New York, move into a house, and they start communicating through rappings, which is basically just like knocking on a table or whatever, with a spirit. And they determine that it's the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered and buried in the house. And they have an older sister who is kind of guiding them. She's a lot older than them, and she's kind of like guiding them, and she is kind of like almost their guardian in a way when they start to get a lot of attention for this ability to communicate with spirits. At first, their neighbors start coming, then people from the town start coming, and eventually they're brought to Rochester and eventually to New York City to start doing public seances on stage and also private seances. And they become part of, in some ways, insiders in the elite, the white elite of their day, but also they're sort of outsiders because they are this kind of fringe. You can see them as performers, and they're kind of this go-between between spirits, mediums. But we can thank them for kind of kicking off the religion of spiritualism. They're still not really calling it spiritualism, but at this point. But it's interesting that it started with, so they were teenagers when this happened, and they spent their whole life performing, you could say, as spiritualists. They had interesting lives, but it also sounded kind of isolating. One of them had a problem with alcohol, and eventually, because she wanted to marry this Arctic explorer, she denounced spiritualism, and she said that everything they did was actually fake, that they were making the noises with their toes. And then she goes back and she says, actually, it wasn't fake, it was all totally real. And this kind of sets the stage for spiritualism in general of like, is it real, isn't it real? So I ask you for this presentation, and just when thinking about both spiritualism and photography, to suspend a little bit of disbelief. And there's this kind of murky ground between what's real, what's not real. Here's a picture of two Victorian ladies and a ghost using a planchette, which is something that is kind of heart-shaped, and you put your hand on it. And it either has a pencil in it, or you move it around on a Ouija board and it receives messages from spirits. I just have a couple of little intro pictures before we start really diving in. Here's a theatrical picture of a seance. So when we're talking about seances, what Kate and Maggie were doing when they were on stage and also in these private seances that they got paid a lot of money for, was people generally would get together around a table and everyone would put their hands on the table, and it had to be dark because supposedly spirits don't like light. And then there would be a medium that would sometimes go into trance, and the spirit would come into their body and take over, and they would start speaking or have spirit speaking through them, or they would just start giving messages. But the idea is that people are gathering together to combine their energy to try to make contact with the other world. When Kate and Maggie are doing these seances, people start to get excited for two reasons. One, because there's this whole idea has opened up about being able to communicate with spirits, being able to have contact with the dead, being able to like not say goodbye. We can also think that in 1848, when spiritualism came into the world, photography only was announced to the world in 1839. So by this time, if you had even one picture of your loved one, you're lucky. So it's not like we all had tons of pictures of people and it's so easy to remember them. Sometimes you'd only have a picture of your loved one. Maybe it would be a picture that you took of them after they had died. And so people are really excited about this idea that you can communicate with spirits, and they want to go and see that demonstrated live. There's no TV, there's no radio, there's less distractions. And so the idea of gathering and being able to see this phenomena or proof that we continue on after the transition called death was thrilling to people. Another reason why seances were thrilling to people was because people were realizing you can make a lot of money off of saying that you were talking to the dead and having a seance. And so there's kind of, again, this murky ground between people claiming that they're spirit or that they're spiritualists or that they're mediums and hosting a seance. And sometimes it was real and sometimes it was a total fake. And a lot of times it was in between. So that when thinking about spiritualism, it's sort of one of those things of like, was it real? Was it not real? Sometimes we can never prove it one way or the other. I like to think it's real because it's more fun. But so here are just some seance images. We're not going to get too into ectoplasm, but I wanted to show this image of ectoplasm. Here's a medium at a seance producing ectoplasm, which is again a way of proving that spiritualism was real. And the idea of ectoplasm is that a spirit would manifest into this thing called ectoplasm and come out of the medium's orifices, but you couldn't touch the ectoplasm or you could hurt the medium. It had to be done in the dark, and ectoplasm was only developed for the camera. We weren't seeing ectoplasm before cameras were invented. So again, there's this relationship between photography and spiritualism, and using photography or having the camera there to witness and be proof that spirits are real. Here are two lovely images of ectoplasm, and you can see the medium on the left has her hands wrapped in net or gauze, and that's so supposedly she can't touch anything, because once people started having seances and trying to prove that spirits were real, there comes in a whole bunch of psychical researchers trying to disprove it. And so they're coming up with all of these methods to prove that it's not real. And we'll talk about that more once we start talking about the spirit photographers. A couple other things to talk about is that women were the ones that were kind of in a lot of ways leading this movement, and they're closely tied with the suffragette movement and with abolitionism. This is one of the first times that we see women being in charge of a religion and also speaking on stage. And so if it wasn't for Victoria Woodhull, who was a spiritualist, and all these other women who we don't even know the names of, who were going on stage and speaking and giving lectures as spiritualists, being mediums, they kind of set the stage and broke the boundary for having women be on stage and presenting. There's kind of this, how do I say? One of the reasons why people were comfortable with it is because women in some ways were handing over their body to spirits. And so it made people who were more misogynist comfortable with having women on stage because they could say, oh, it's not the woman giving the lecture, it's the spirit coming through. Whatever they think about it. In any case, women were on stage, and that never turned around, which is great. Then comes the Civil War, which 1861 to 65, tons of people are dying, and spiritualism gets even more popular because of this idea of like, there's so many people grieving, and tensions are so high that they need to find a way to feel like they're still connected with their loved ones who have passed. And so this is kind of like the heyday of spiritualism. At the now it sounds maybe a little bit bonkers to some people, but at the time it was not fringe. It was totally mainstream to be spiritualist. There was seances in the White House. It was something that everyone just talked about as if it was any other religion. And a lot of times people would be the religion that they were born into or chose or whatever was, and spiritualist. So it's not like you were giving up your religion for spiritualism, although some people did, but it was working in tandem. So let's see. Here's just one more image. This is a spirit trumpet. It's almost like a megaphone for spirits. I just really like this image. And we're going to start talking about spirit photography. Here is an image. So before we do that, I just want, again, let's just suspend our disbelief that this isn't true or possible. And one thing I wanted to mention is that spiritualism and photography were both coming up around the same time. And we're going to get a little out there, which is that the Neptune was in Pisces. Neptune is the planet of belief, faith, the unseen, and it rules Pisces, which is about being able to cross between the worlds, having one foot in this world, one in the other, kind of like the totality of energy. The last time Neptune was in Pisces was around this time the photography and spiritualism was coming about. And here we are again today with Neptune in Pisces, which I think that is a big reason why there's like this renewed interest in everything like witchy, spiritual, occult, eccentric, esoteric. Also, just keep in mind that before 1839, there were no photographs. And so once photography is announced to the world, it's almost like at this point, anything is possible. And people are trying to understand, okay, so you can capture an image on a piece of metal or paper and carry it around with you and you have it forever. That just must have been so mind-blowing. And people's minds are really open to what the possibilities of photography can do. And so if you can take a picture of a person, why can't you take a picture of a spirit? So this is kind of like the mind frame that people are in around this time. So thank you for going down this road with me and keeping your mind open while we talk about this. I really like this image because it represents, so this is a spirit photo, and I like it because usually when you were going to have your spirit photo taken, you would go, and then a spirit would show up next to you, hopefully. But in this case, someone has sent a photograph that's sitting on this table to represent the person that is sitting in for the photo, and then a spirit has showed up, and the photographer has left room for the spirit to kind of be featured in this photo. Again, I just want to re-emphasize that photography was not available to everyone at the time. It really was like white, wealthy people that had access to photography in general at the beginning, and especially spirit photography. So here we go. We're going to start talking. Do we have any questions so far? I can't see anything, but Michaela, do we have any questions that I need to answer right now?
No questions so far.
We will start talking about our first photographer, kind of the person who fathered spirit photography, William Mumler. In 1861, William Mumler was in Boston, and he was an engraver, but he wanted to learn photography. And he was learning the wet plate process, which is essentially, I'm not going to go into all the chemicals of it, but basically you kind of have to do things quickly because you have to do everything while the chemicals are wet in the camera. And he is at this photo studio, Mrs. H.F. Stewart's photographic gallery. And he ends up flirting with the receptionist there, and they get married. And the receptionist is a medium. And her name is Hannah. I don't know her maiden name, but she was married to Mumler. So Hannah Mumler is her married name. And so one day, William Mumler is alone in the studio, and he's trying to take a selfie. And he develops it, and he notices what he thinks is a spirit next to him. And so he shows it to this friend of his who was a spiritualist. And next thing you know, that friend goes to two spiritualist newspapers, the Banner of Light, which was in Boston, and the Herald of Progress in New York, two pretty big spiritualist newspapers. And now, you know, it's all over the place. So even though he's not the first person to have captured a spirit on film, or at this point would have been wet plate, glass plate, but he was the one that's kind of credited with making it widespread and well known. He wasn't interested in spiritualism. His wife was, but soon he started saying that he was the medium for taking spirit photos. He ended up quitting his job as an engraver to do spirit photography full time. And people would come to him from all over the country, or like we saw in the previous slide, they would send in a photo that he would take a photo of, and hopefully a spirit would show up. He did not guarantee that a spirit would show up, and sometimes he had to go back several times. To put it into context, at the time, if you went to go get your picture taken, it cost about 25 cents. He was doing $10 a sitting. This is in 1861 money. So I didn't work out what that was, but that is a huge difference. And sometimes people had to come back several times to actually get a spirit in the photo. So he's like, business is booming. And of course, like all spiritualists, his relationship or his reputation gets tarnished, and his relationship to spiritualism gets a little bit bumpy because in 1863, about 2 years after he started doing his spirit photos, someone recognized an image that was recycled from a previous sitter who was alive, but that image was supposed to be a spirit. I just wanted to point out that this image on the right is Mary Todd Lincoln, and this is supposedly the spirit of Abraham Lincoln showing up in her picture. So this is how mainstream spirit photography and spiritualism was, that you know, someone like Mary Todd Lincoln would have gone and gotten a spirit photo taken. I'm just gonna keep scrolling through. This is actually not a mummler, this is out of order, but I love this image. Here are more mumblers. And so these are different ways that, that spirits can show up in images. They can show, a lot of times they're holding an anchor. Sometimes they're having kind of like putting flowers around people's heads. Here's one on the right, touching a photograph. On the left, we see what is supposed to be some sort of like Native American spirit guide. And I wanted to talk about this for a second because spiritualists have, they like saying that they have Native American spirit guides, and they aren't very self-reflective about how that might be problematic as white people, saying that that Native American people who, you know, they have displaced and caused some genocide too are all of a sudden now they're spirit guides, and this idea that Native American people, we can take their religion. So that's just a little, I put that in there because that is, you know, spiritualists are not immune to appropriation and kind of like almost fetishizing other cultures' spirituality. And here are other ways that spirits would show up. So sometimes, I'm gonna go back a second because on these you can see they're kind of transparent. And then here they're almost more, it almost looks like they're like glued on. So I'm gonna go back and talk about Mumler for a second more. So because Mumler is accused of recycling images, his reputation suffered, and he ends up moving to New York in 1868, and he starts making spirit photos there. And then in 1869, he's arrested for fraud and larceny. He is put on trial, and there's international press coverage. P.T. Barnum is brought as an authority on detecting humbugs, and he is working with all of these kind of investigators who are trying to figure out how he's doing it. It must be a fraud. They're following him into the darkroom. They're giving him they're called plates, but you can think of them as negatives to use of their own that have been tested. They're watching his every move, and they cannot figure out how he's doing it. So he's acquitted, but his reputation is destroyed. He moves back to Boston. He keeps making spirit photos, and this is when Mary Todd Lincoln goes to see him, and actually his business just like keeps going. But he ends up dying in 1884 in poverty, and they say obscurity, but it can't be that obscure because we still know who he is. So we can thank William Mumler for spirit photography. This is just like a back of a spirit, or this is like a spirit advertisement card for a French photographer, which we'll be talking about. And here are just some other ways that spirits show up. So of course, these photographers are being accused of double exposure, is how people think that they're doing it. Ooh. Okay, and here's an image of a seance, not by Mumler, but we are gonna start, wait, sorry. I think my slides got a little messed up, but here's more Mumler. Here's a whole kind of book of all of Mumler's photos. And most of them you see a spirit with their arm around the sitter, hovering next to sometimes more than one image or more than one spirit shows up. And a lot of times people would leave saying, oh yes, I recognize that person as my grandfather, whoever it is. And so he is kind of setting not only the tone for spirit photography, but also kind of the aesthetic, or what we come to expect in what a spirit photo would look like. People start getting playful with that and coming up with other kind of ways to show spirits in their photos. But this is kind of the beginning of the spirit photo movement. Here we see a spirit reaching out to touch the hand of the sitter, and then there's another spirit to his right. But again, they don't know. I mean, it could have been a double exposure, but it was never figured out how he did it. Here's an article from the trial. So this was like front page news, and a pretty big deal. And I would have loved to read the transcripts or been at that trial because I'm sure it was kind of funny. Okay, next we're going to talk about Frederick Hudson.
Real quick, we've got a couple questions.
Yes.
So one video or one question says, what do you think of orbs in pictures or videos?
That's something that I was going to talk about at the end, but that is kind of the modern spirit photography in a way. And I know that people are really into orb photography and the idea that that's how spirits are interacting with our cameras now. I have had some weird things in my photos that were not explained, and I like to think that they're spirits, but you know, I think it's also like what you believe. So if you think it's just a piece of dust, then maybe that's what it is. And if you actually think that it's a spirit, maybe it is a spirit. I feel like we still don't totally know like how, you know, like there's some photo process, we still don't even totally know how it works. So it's possible that spirits are just like working with what they have.
Then we have a question about Mumler, and they ask, when he was taking spirit photos, did he use any different settings or techniques while taking the photo?
So he was using the wet plate process. Here, I'll go back to an image so we can look at that while I'm talking. So he was using the wet plate process, which is what was popular around the time. And this, I'll briefly describe how it works, which is maybe will help illustrate why he could have maybe cheated, or however you want to think about it. But the idea is that you would take a piece of either glass or metal, dip it in a light sensitive chemical, put it into the camera, take the picture while it's wet, and while it's wet, bring it in the darkroom, develop it. But you don't get to see, you know, like he's the only one in the darkroom loading these plates, and there is the possibility that you could put another plate on top of it to create a double exposure. Again, he was not caught. He was observed doing his process and observed getting spirits on the film, and it was never figured out how he was doing it if it wasn't actually spirits. But to my understanding, you know, at that point, it's not like you could like drag your stuff all over the place pretty easily. People would come to you, to your photo studio where he was set up, and then you have to have a darkroom nearby to do these processes. So it was, as far as I know, he was only working in wet plate photography. It's called wet plate collodion.
Perfect. And they added to that question, but he didn't do anything different in the room when the photo was taken?
So the idea is that while he was in the room, a lot of times his wife, who was a spiritualist medium, was also in the room. And you know, there's kind of like this like playing up the drama of it. And so as far as I know, he wasn't, I'm not sure what they mean by doing something different, but he would just be there taking the picture and then going in the darkroom to develop it. they wouldn't like be doing a seance or anything, but sometimes his wife, who was a medium, was there, and that supposedly affected the energy of the room. Did that clarify that person's question?
I think so.
Okay.
We've got 2 more questions here
Sure.
before we keep going. One is the photo of Mary Todd Lincoln supposed to be Abe and Willie,
Yes.
or one of their other past sons?
Let's look. I'm pretty sure, I don't know which son it's supposed to be, but it's, I want to say it's clearly Abe Lincoln. To me, it looks like Abe Lincoln. I don't know who the other son is, but I know that she had seances in the White House and was already into this. And then when Lincoln died, this is when she kind of goes, and she didn't say who she was when she went to William Mumler. She didn't say, "I married Todd Lincoln." And so when this image comes up, then it was kind of more proof that it's real, because he might not have recognized her or known that Abraham Lincoln was going to show up.
Yeah, and so another person is adding to that. It looks like a second person is in the image next to Abe.
Yeah. I don't know who the other spirit is supposed to be, but it could have been one of her sons.
All right, another question popped in, so 2 more. There's a question, a few of the photos were of people with their eyes closed or looking down.
Yes.
I assume these photos are of people who are dead, as that was common then?
So I'm going to assume that they're alive. But that is a thing that people would have their images taken after they had passed. It's possible. I didn't read anything about William Mumler taking pictures of deceased people. It could be that their eyes are closed or down because the exposure is really long. The reason why people look so stiff or rigid or aren't smiling in old photos is not because they're bored or unhappy, but because the exposure was so long and the light was sometimes so bright coming in from the skylight that it was like almost painful, and sometimes their head would be in a clamp and they couldn't move. And so sometimes it's just easier to close the eyes. But and none of the captions of these photos that I was looking at said that the person was deceased, but that is a thing that people would take pictures of dead people, because sometimes that's the only chance you get to have a picture of them. But in that case, you would have to bring that person or that body up probably several flights of stairs, because photographers' studios would be on the top floor so they could have a big skylight. So this means you're like hauling around a body to the photographer. But as far as I know, none of these are of deceased people.
All right, and then another question here, the last one for this little bit, but great job sending them in. I think this makes it more fun. Has any modern photographer attempted to replicate Mumler's spirit photography using equipment from the period?
Yes, and I will talk more about that at the end, because we're going to talk a little bit about modern contemporary photographers. But yes, there's one person that you might like looking into. His name is Mark Osterman. He teaches at the George Eastman House in Rochester, New York, and he teaches all sorts of antiquated photo processes, and he has taught a spirit photography class. And by that, I don't mean that he is actually trying to connect with spirits. He's just doing double exposures, but they do look like spirit photos. And his work is really cool, and we have a couple others to talk about at the end. But I should say he's using historic photo processes to do it. Are there any other questions, or otherwise I can keep going?
Yeah, not for now. So
Okay.
Keep going, and if people have questions, send them in. It works well that way.
I'll just keep kind of pausing after each batch of photographer we're going to talk about for more questions.
Perfect.
Okay, so here we are going on to Frederick Hudson. So Frederick Hudson was a British spirit photographer. Spirit photography came on the scene in London in 1872. He was kind of playing around with a couple and was like, hey, what if, they were called the Guppies, that was their last name. And he was like, hey, what if we try to make a spirit photo? And they ended up making one. And so the news spread, and next thing you know, he's really busy taking spirit photos. Again, there's all these questions. Is this a double exposure? Is someone dressing up like a ghost in the studio? People kept trying to catch him cheating, and they couldn't figure out how he was doing it. But, you know, this kind of looks like someone dressed up in a sheet. But because of the way, you know, people have analyzed the photos and said, well, they couldn't be a double exposure because of the way that it's kind of overlapping. And you'd think that someone would have noticed that someone was like gliding around wearing a bed sheet over them, pretending to be a ghost or a spirit. So that, again, this is like, we don't have proof that it wasn't real, and we don't have proof that it was real. So his spirits look a lot different than Mumler's spirits. And so you can kind of, once we start looking at more spirit photos, it's interesting to see how it changes based on where and who's taking the picture. And I just wanted to say that he, again, people kept trying to catch him. He had researchers watching him, his process, how he did it, and they could not figure it out. One thing that happens in 1875 is in Paris, the prosecution of Edward Isidore Bouget, I'm not sure if I'm saying his name right, but he is making spirit photos with double exposures. And because of that, it kind of puts the damper on all the spirit photography business. And so pretty soon after that happens, Frederick Hudson ends up retiring. But we're going to talk about Edward Isidore Bouget. And if anyone speaks French and knows how to say his last name, I would love to know. Here's a kind of pixelated image of one of his. He's the first French spirit photographer. And he's, I think, I have two favorites, but he's one of my favorite spirit photographers. He really plays up the drama. And so he says, oh, I have a little industry turning out ghosts. And he and his assistant at the studio make this sitting feel like it's a ritual. They really play it up. He gets really dramatic about it. He wants to make it feel like you're actually going to a seance, not just a photo studio. One thing he does is he also makes people wait a really long time for their images, or sometimes will ask to come back another day, and he just kind of drags it out and like draws out the mystique of it, and acts really theatrical the whole time that he's taking the picture, which I appreciate. In 1874, he's arrested for fraud. And in the trial, he actually admits to doing double exposures. He says that he is a fraud, or he says basically, yes, I'm making this up, it's not real. But guess what? He goes back to photographing after that, and people don't seem to care all that much. Then he starts calling himself a conjurer photographer. And he starts making all these kind of like, he kind of plays with it. And it's around the same time that, you know, spiritualism has been around for about 30 years at this point, and people have gone everywhere from like feeling like they actually have connected with one of their loved ones, getting messages from spirits that the medium could have no idea any of this information that they're getting, all the way to the other end of the spectrum of people just like taking their money and running, or taking their money and like being exposed of just like being dressed up as a ghost when you turn on the lights. So there's kind of, again, this like whole spectrum of in between. And then there's legitimate mediums that maybe every day they can't get a spirit, and so they just play it up a little bit. So it's really hard to tell like who is a believer, who's not, who's representing the religion fully, who's not. And because of that, the religion solidifies into now what we're calling spiritualism. And there's the National Association of Spiritualist Churches that develop these the tenets that we read at the beginning, and they really want to keep it on the up and up. They really have some strict protocols about who can call themselves a spiritualist medium, because they don't want to be seen as frauds. They want to keep the reputation of spiritualism going. They really do believe that we can communicate with spirits. And they're trying to separate themselves from just like hucksters or people who like are realizing that they can make a lot of money and go on to the next town. Because remember, this is the 1800s. You can't just text your friend and be like, oh, I was just ripped off by a spiritualist medium. Watch out, they're coming to your town next. So they can kind of like keep creating this fraud over and over again. And there's plenty of spirit mediums that are doing that. But there's also plenty of spirit mediums that their whole life really believe that they're communicating with spirits. So there's also this whole in between where people kind of start playing with it. And it's after Edward gets arrested and says, yes, I am actually faking it all, that it almost opens the door to give people permission to kind of like start playing with it a little bit more. And like, it's more tongue in cheek, like, haha, yep, this is a spirit photo. So he makes these, he starts calling himself an anti-spirit photographer, and he starts making images for entertainment. not to encourage the belief of spirits. And so here are some of the ones that he makes, and I love them. They're just so funny. Clearly he's glued his head on this skeleton. And in this one, you know, he's making a chair levitate. So this is kind of like campier, almost making it a joke, but it's using the same processes possibly that the other spirit photographers were using, but he's just being transparent about it. Any questions?
Yes.
Okay.
So we've got 2 comments on the pronunciation.
Thank you.
One says Bouguette and the other says Bouguet.
Okay.
And then we have a question. If the spirits were models, wouldn't the people in the image know that was happening too?
That's the thing. That's why it's like, that's the first thing we jump to is either it's a double exposure or there's a model, and neither have proven to be true. You would think that you would notice someone like walking around pretending to be a ghost. And you would think that one of these researchers who took their job really seriously, because there was tons of people who were really mad about spiritualist mediums taking money from people who they saw as vulnerable. And they wanted to stop spirit photographers, spirit mediums, you know, people who were making money off of the industry of spiritualism. But in the case of William Mumler and Frederick Hudson, they could not figure it out. And these were people who were well-versed in photography and how the processes worked. They were with them in the darkroom. They were with them at every move of the process, and they couldn't figure it out. So yeah, you would think that you would notice someone gliding around dressed as a ghost, but there's also the possibility that someone like that people wanted to believe so badly that they were willing to ignore it, or you know, maybe there was ways of doing it with like mirrors or double pane glass or any of these things that are like that, like Pepper's ghost kind of phenomenon, but they have not been able to figure out how Mumler was doing it.
Yeah, and so the person that asked that question also said, as an aside, the top floor photo studio and dead bodies made me think of Weekend at Bernie's.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, one thing, if you go to like a town that still has old buildings from around this era, you can kind of figure out which might be the photo studios, because they might have either the skylight still there or like a slanted wall that has been covered up. Like it would be a skylight that was covered up that's facing north. But yeah, photography, because there's no electricity, and so they were trying to use the benefit of natural light. But I saw an advertisement for taking pictures of your deceased loved ones, and it was like, you have to come to us, basically. Sometimes you could get a photographer to go to you, but that was a bigger ordeal and more expensive. Are there other questions?
Yeah, another one right here is, can you speak to Harry Houdini's dedication to debunking spiritualists, and if he focused on any photographers?
So I don't know if he was focusing on any photographers, but I do know that he was really committed to debunking spiritualism. If you didn't know, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes was a devout spiritualist. He wrote tons of books on spiritualism, really big in the spiritualist movement. And he had kind of like a friendly rivalry with Houdini. But Houdini had this pact with his wife because he was so... Again, these people who wanted to debunk spiritualism, it's not because they were like party poopers. It was because they saw people getting, you know, sometimes spending a lot of money that they might not even have trying to communicate with their deceased loved ones and in this really vulnerable emotional state. And they're like, this isn't right. People are making money off of people who are really vulnerable and really at a low point. And so Houdini kind of devotes part of his life to trying to debunk it. So he had this pact with his wife that whoever died first would come back and say this phrase that only they would know to the other one. It ended up not happening. But as an aside, there's some people think that Houdini was murdered by the spiritualist mafia. I don't know if there really was a spiritualist mafia, but it's fun to think that there was. But there was kind of like a mysterious circumstance of events. He ended up getting punched in the stomach by someone who was a spiritualist, and then it ended up dying because of that. And then there's all these conspiracies started around that. But yeah, he was one of the people who would show up and really try to prove that spiritualism wasn't real. He was very vocalism about spiritualism not being real, not giving your money to spiritualists, not going to seances, that sort of thing. Are there other questions?
Wonderful. That's all for now.
Okay.
So
We will keep going, and we're going to talk about William Hope. He was a carpenter in England who said that he discovered his gifts as a medium photographer by chance. He made more than 2,500 spirit photos. And again, the newspaper, the Daily Mail, set up a committee to examine his photos, and they determined that they were a hoax. And also there's this organization that was really involved in researching spiritualists called the Society for Psychical Research. And they monitored him, and they found out that he was switching plates, plates are another way of saying a negative. But basically what they did was, well, and this even is murky because some people think that he wasn't doing it, that he was set up. There was all this kind of spiritualist drama. And so we don't know if he's the one committing fraud, someone was committing fraud. And basically the way they figured it out is they gave him these plates and said, you're going to take a picture on these. Essentially, they gave him some, we'll call it film just for the sake of this conversation, and said, you have to use this film. But once it was developed, they figured out because they like x-rayed and they put some markings on it that he hadn't used it. But again, going back, they're like, well, actually, we don't know if he knew or this other person gave it to him that might have set him up. So there was some sort of fraud going on, but it's hard to say what was happening. But in these, I mean, this one looks like a doll or a pig. You know, one of the things that some people who were doing fraud would do was either recycle images from pictures that they had taken of live people. They would take pictures of newspaper images or cutouts and kind of like almost, I don't want to say glue them on, but like when developing them, they would just kind of put them in there. And so they end up looking a little more flat or drawn on like this one. And these look a little bit more like an illustration. And these are just kind of light squiggles. And here is a picture of a seance with a ghostly hand coming up. This is one of my favorite spirit images just because they get really dramatic with it. And then here is supposed to be a spirit in the car. And I'm pretty sure this is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with a spirit. Okay, so you've been noticing we've only been talking about men so far. But here we've got a woman, Emma Deane. She was in England, and in 1920, she discovered a face in a photo that she took. She was 58 when she started taking spirit photos. And I think one of the reasons why there aren't a ton of female spirit photographers is one, maybe there were and we just don't know about them. And two, you know, just in general, there weren't as many women photographing as there were men because women were the one tasked with like running the house and taking care of kids, and they could support their husbands and going like tinkering and darkroom photography. There definitely were women photographers. Anna Atkins was a photographer that like invented the photo book. But in this realm, there's so many spirit photographers that we're not talking about tonight. But she's one of my favorites because she starts taking these, she did spirit photos like all the ones that we've seen where it's a person in a studio and a spirit shows up. But she does this series of commemorating Armistice Day at the end of World War I. And she takes these photos, she starts in 1921, and then she takes one in 1922 and 1923. And the idea is that these are all images of soldiers who died in World War I. And they're kind of like this cloud of faces that show up. In 1924, she's getting ready to do her annual Armistice Day photo. And before she does, she's accused of fraud. And it turns out people said that the faces she was using were living football players and boxers. And so she doesn't end up taking the one in 1924, but it is an interesting idea that on the anniversary of this occasion honoring the fallen in World War I, that they have all come together for a group photo. Let's see. So I just wanted to talk about spiritualism in Minnesota for a second, unless we have questions that came up during that batch?
Yes, we do. So, two questions right now. Are there any discernible differences between the photos of those photographers who admitted or were proven to be frauds and those who weren't?
Not really. That's kind of the thing. I mean, the only one that has been proven to be a fraud by like a court is Edward Isidore Bouget. And he kind of has fun with it and doesn't hurt his reputation at all. And even the people who like Mumler went to trial, and after that, his business was still booming. And so when we look at the Edward Isidore photos, like they do look kind of faker, but again, like there's only so many ways. They didn't have Photoshop. There's only so many ways that so many techniques they could have been using. But it's kind of hard to tell. The ones like his photos look really similar to other ones that were not exposed as frauds.
Another question is, to your point about a photographer maybe using an existing photo, wouldn't that have been fairly easy to prove? For example, wouldn't the photo of Abraham Lincoln have been well known to some extent?
For sure, and that's part of some people's complaints is that in these calls of fraud, they're saying, hey, that's like, it might be like, that was a picture from a newspaper that I just saw, or I know that person and they're not dead. Why are they showing up as a spirit? So it kind of was, but also it wasn't provable in court, apparently, except for Edward Isidore Bouget. But yes, you would think so. And there are plenty of like photos. I didn't put any of there's so many really good photos of seances where people are manifesting spirits, and there's some that are clearly cutouts from a magazine or ectoplasm. They would sometimes have images coming out in the ectoplasm that would be like a newspaper, like that had put glued onto the ectoplasm. So there's a lot of like people doing things and hoping that they won't notice, and people want to believe so badly that they don't care. And then there's things that we just can't prove that it is fake, but it's kind of, they all kind of look similar.
Those are all the questions for now. Thanks.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about spiritualism in Minnesota because it definitely was here alive and well. The first time that spiritualism is referenced in Minnesota was in 1858. By 1860, there's supposedly 4,000 spiritualists in Minnesota, according to the 4th Annual Spirit Register. That's about 2% of the population. That's before the Civil War. And we know that during the Civil War, spiritualism really exploded and took off. There was all sorts of events, conferences. This is an image from the State Spiritualist Association of Minnesota meeting that was happening at the Nicollet Hotel. The Minnesota History Center has a bunch of spiritualist documents on microfilm that you can go and look at whenever we can go in public again. And here's like a little kind of a ticket from an event, a meeting, but they were all over the place. And I will show you, here is a map of spiritualist churches, mediums, clairvoyants, and healers at the height of spiritualist popularity in Minneapolis, St. Paul. They were all over the state, but there was a concentration in the Twin Cities. And I just have a little quote from the Minneapolis Tribune from September 27th, 1920. There was an article that said, "Spiritualist says soul photographs are possible. That science, through tireless work, has found it possible to photograph the ego of the shrouded soul as it is taking leave of the body immediately following death, and that the X-ray has made it possible to photograph the thoughts that emanate from the mind of the miser and the philanthropist," was stated yesterday before an audience of spiritualists and friends at Minnehaha Hall. So spiritualism was definitely here. We hosted several national spiritualist meetings. And now, like a lot of spiritualism, it has died down in this area. It's still kind of going strong in like New England and in England. But you can kind of think about like there were tons of spiritualists and mediums all over the place. There was ads from them in the newspapers. You could send in, you could do it by mail. You didn't even have to go. And so again, it was like totally ingrained in the culture of the city. There's a couple of like funny things that happened at spiritualist meetings here. There was like, you know, of course, people getting caught dressing up as ghosts and then being tackled and being exposed as being a fraud. There was at one point, they were having a spiritualist meeting and the health department busted in and was like, you all need to get vaccinated right now. And spiritualists were borrowing, I think it was a Lutheran church, and I accidentally burnt it down. So there's definitely spiritualist activity here. I couldn't find any spirit photographers that were from Minnesota. If anyone knows of any, I would love to see it. It seems to be a little bit more of like a Boston, New York, and Europe thing. But I just wanted to show that it was definitely here. Do we have questions before we start talking about kind of the more modern spiritualists, spirit photographers?
None came in this time.
Here's another one of my
So we're good.
favorite photographers. His name is T.G. Hamilton. He was a Canadian doctor, and he was also a spiritualist. And he held seances in his home and documented them in the 1920s and 30s. Here is a medium with an ectoplasmic hand. Here is, I think it's a spirit photo. And again, here's another medium with ectoplasm on her face, and more ectoplasm. And so when we talk about ectoplasm, even though it's not technically a spirit photo, it is a photo of a spirit trying to manifest. And it was specifically for the camera. They were doing, this ectoplasm was materializing for the cameras, for the sake of the camera, kind of like for the audience was the camera. And then afterwards, supposedly, like the ectoplasm would get sucked back into the body. I will say that the ectoplasm that has survived and is in a museum, all of it has been proven to be either cheesecloth or like animal entrails. But that's not to say that there wasn't real ectoplasm. But T.G. Hamilton is really cool. Here is what I kind of was talking about before. Here's ectoplasm coming out that has faces in it. So he had a whole room set up. He had cameras set up. He had the whole situation. And you can go, if you Google T.G. Hamilton, his archives are online. I think it's through through a university in Manitoba, I think it is. But you can see he's got like hundreds of his photos online. And he was really treating it like a science. So he would have all of these kind of like documentation and notes about how the photo was taken and what was happening when the photo was taken. Because again, spiritualists really wanted to be seen as a science, and they were really into proving that communication with spirits was real. So here's kind of his setup for a seance. He has all of these cameras going. And here's a list of all of the cameras and what he's doing. He's using 5x7 for the most part, all kinds of flashes. So he's like ready to capture a spirit. And here's an illustration of how people would sit around the table, who was there. They would usually make a list of like who was there every time. They would try to have the same people at every seance to build up the energy. And then that cabinet, there would be a medium sitting in it's called a spirit cabinet. And the idea is that you would like build up energy in this cabinet. It's basically just like a phone booth kind of situation. But this was his whole kind of setup to capture spirits. Moving more into the modern era, and kind of expanding our definition of what spirit photography is, there was this photographer, Ted Serios. And before I forget, at MIA, I think it's in 2022, there's going to be a show that has some of his work in it. And so he was in Denver in the 1960s, and he was a bellhop. And this psychologist, Dr. Jules Eisenbud, discovered him, and they started working together for about 3 years on what Ted called his photography. And so Ted Serios thought that he could psychically project images onto Polaroid. They always used Polaroid. And they never figured out how he was doing it. there were images that would show up of places, but it would be a hodgepodge of that place over time. So it would be like a hotel that had the shutters from 1920 and the awnings from 1960, but they'd all be in the same photo. It's a really, there's a book that Dr. Jules Eisenbud wrote about Ted Saros that has a bunch of his images in it. But if you just Google Ted Saros, you can see all sorts of his images, and they're really beautiful regardless of whether they're spirit photos or photography or whatever you'd think. But there's kind of this idea that like you're using your spirit or asking spirits to intervene and create an image on Polaroid film. So here are some of his photos. And then we'll start talking about Shannon Taggart. She's a photographer who's working right now. She's been photographing at Lilydale, which is a town of mediums in upstate New York. It's about an hour outside of Buffalo, kind of close to Jamestown. It's a gated community. You have to be a medium registered through the National Association of Spiritualist Churches to own a house there. It's sort of Disney World for spiritualists. So she's been working with them for years, photographing their seances. Here's a medium in a spirit cabinet. Here is a medium who is almost like reproducing themselves, or their spirit is showing up alongside them. Here is an image of an ectoplasmic, a medium's hand that is, they're really into wax hands back in the day, and they have this museum. So she's just like kind of bringing spirit photography into this century. There is a photographer, Laura Larson, who is kind of also working with this like table tapping pictures of seances and pictures of ectoplasm. These are modern photographs made to look like ectoplasmic photos. And then I will show you work that I do with Maria Motani, and we did an ectoplasmic series that called Ectoplasm Selfies, and I shot them either with Polaroid or direct positive 4x5, and then printed them as albumin, which is the photo process that they were using for a large period of the spirit photos. So we did a seance, and then we asked people to charge up their ectoplasm, which we were using cheesecloth, and then we asked people to sculpt their own ectoplasmic photos. And I just put in some books that you might want to check out if you're interested in learning more about spirit photography. There was a show at the Met, the Metropolitan Museum, in 2005 called The Perfect Medium: Photography and the Occult, and the catalog for it is amazing. It has some of the spirit photographers that we talked about. It goes on to all sorts of other sorts of photography and its interaction with the occult and with spiritualism. The book on the right, The Apparitionists, is a lot about William Mumler and also kind of the invention of photography and like the industry of photography coming about. It's a really interesting book if you're interested in the beginning of photography and or spirit photos. Here's another one, Photography and Spirit. We didn't talk about these Cottingley Fairy images that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really defended, but that's kind of another spirit photo realm. And then there's two more books, The Strange Case of William Mumler, spirit photographer, that talks all about William Mumler and his trial and his life and his business. And then Shannon Taggart's book, Seance, it's a beautiful book. There's intro by Dan Aykroyd. Dan Aykroyd, in case you didn't know, is a 4th generation spiritualist. We have him to thank for the Ghostbusters and the ectoplasm in Ghostbusters. His great-grandfather was a contemporary of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and wrote a lot about spiritualism. And Dan Aykroyd is a spiritualist himself. So he did the intro for this book. And we have some of them at the Future if you wanted to pick one up in Minneapolis. Otherwise, I know she has them on her website, and it's a really gorgeous book. And she's really interesting to listen to talk about photographing at Lilydale. So that is, I think, all of my slides. I just wanted to say what happened to spiritualism. It kind of fell out of popularity after the Civil War and after a lot of people who are fake mediums were debunked, kind of gave real mediums a bad name. And now you kind of have to search to find, there are still spiritualist churches. There's Lilydale, the town of mediums in upstate New York. There's one in Wanawak, Wisconsin. There's a spiritualist camp there. There's one in Indiana, in Florida. And then in Milwaukee, there is the Morris Pratt Institute, which is a school of spiritualism. And then there's a school in England called Arthur Findlay College, and they are serious. That is like Hogwarts for spiritualists. But you can kind of think about spiritualism. It's still going, and when I was involved in it, I noticed there was a lot of people working in the medical or like the healthcare industry, and it could be because they're dealing with people as they're crossing over to the other side. And when we think about spirit photography, we can also think about like there are still people that are ghost hunters or are using all this like new technology to try to capture ghosts. You can file orb photography under that. There are definitely people that are like working with spirits and technology that might not look like the 19th century spirit photography, but it's definitely in the same vein. I think that's my last slide. Here's my contact info if you want to talk more about it, or if you wanted to see my work. And I can I can stop sharing unless you wanted to see any images or go back to anything before I do.
Yeah, leave it up and I can read these in case you want to go back
Sure.
to anything, and in case
I'll just
people
leave
are
it on.
writing down things. But we have, so send in your questions now if you have them. We have a question here that is asking, so are yours fake, your photos with cheesecloth?
Yes, they are fake. They are not real spirits coming through, but I also like to think about like what is fake, what is real. Maybe spirits were there. I feel like if you ask a spirit to be there, even if you can't physically see it, it might be influencing, but it is just cheesecloth. And we were using the traditional recipe for cheesecloth, or for ectoplasm, which was cheesecloth, flour, and eggs.
We have two comments after that. One is the Taggarts. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that book is sold out, this person says.
We have some at the Future. We have at least one. So if you're interested and you wanted to pick it up in Minneapolis, or I can also ship it, we do have a couple of them.
Wonderful. And then another attendee says that Casadega, Florida is amazing.
Oh, good. I haven't been there, but I've heard it is really cool. And they've got a lot of archives. And this show that's going to be at MIA, I know that they're getting art from Lilydale and maybe some other places. I know I think it's not until 2022, but if you're interested in, keep an eye out because I'm really excited about what they're bringing here. It's going to be really cool to see it in person.
We don't have any questions right now, so send them in if you have them. I have a question. Is when you're doing all of this research and when you look into it again and again, is there a story that sticks with you or something that was really fun to find out when you got interested in these things?
Oh God, there's so many. People are so goofy, and it's just interesting, like when someone wants to believe something, what they'll look aside on. But I think one of the interesting, this is not spirit photography related, but I think one of a really interesting story is Helen Duncan. She was the last person to be persecuted under the Witchcraft Act. It was in the 50s in England. And she's another one of those people that like, sometimes she was a fraud. Sometimes, she was like hiding things on her clothes during seances so that she could pull them out later. But she also was transmitting real information. And the reason why she was tried was because, I'm going to see if I can remember this right, but the reason why she was tried was because someone came to her for a reading and she was like, hey, did you know that this ship was sunk? And it was the British government ended up finding her and being like, how did you know that? Because we haven't released this information to the public yet, that yes, a ship had been hit during World War II, and she was deemed a security threat and put in jail. And they couldn't figure out how she got this information. She said that it was a message from a spirit. So it's kind of this like crossover between the government almost acknowledging that communication with spirits is real, because Helen Duncan had this information that she could not have had as a civilian, but also like realizing that she was dangerous and they needed to like keep her under control, which kind of, I think, the overarching, I don't know if theme is the word, but like going back to women leading the spiritualist movement and having that dovetail so much with suffragettes, which we don't talk about. A lot of the suffragettes were spiritualists, or like Sojourner Truth was a spiritualist. Spiritualism had a big overlap with the abolitionist movement, and it was like led by women, and I think that's something that we don't really talk about. And I didn't, even when I was going to school for photography, we didn't learn any of this stuff about spirit photography, which is like a niche topic, but also like that it overlaps with all of these like really important issues of its day, and how we have spiritualism to thank for women being able to like speak in public and not be charlatans. And so I think like one of the overarching things, and there's tons of books I've written about this, but of women's role in spiritualism, and how spiritualism, even though now we see it as like this really fringe kind of out there kind of religion, at the time it was so normal that now I think we don't maybe even make the connections between who these people in history were also involved in this, in talking to spirits, and like this whole spiritual aspect of people that we erase, especially like in the suffragist movement. I just think there's a really cool like overlap there. But there's tons of hilarious stories and like blunders and people pretending to be ghosts. That's for another day, I suppose.
Yeah, wonderful. We have a question there saying, can you speak more about the Cottingley fairies and why Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was so adamant the photos were real? Did Houdini have anything to say about it?
Did who have anything to say about it?
Houdini.
I don't know if Houdini had anything to say about it. As far as I know, it was like some girls taking pictures. They were like drawing fairies on paper. Here, I'll go back to it. They were drawing fairies on paper and then taking pictures of them and saying, oh, look, we took a picture of a fairy. And, oh no, where is my fairy photo? Did I pass it?
I didn't see it. Maybe we were going too fast.
Sorry. Well, I don't know where it went, but I'll land on here. So the idea was that there are these girls, I think they were friends and maybe two of them are sisters, and they were drawing fairies just on paper and then taking pictures of them kind of like in this like beautiful nature scene, and then being like, oh, look, we got pictures of fairies. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle really went with it and was just really believed it, wanted it to be true. They ended up saying something like, yeah, like we drew it, or something came out. I need to refresh my memory, but like something came out where it was just drawings of fairies. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle kind of wouldn't let it go and wouldn't almost believe that it was fake. And I think we can just like think about how people saw photography back then. There was like, it was the idea that like if the camera captured it, it was real. Like there was no way that you could fake a photo. So of course it's real. And so if a spirit shows up, or if a fairy shows up, or anything, or an alien, or whatever it is, of course it's real. Like there's no way that you can fake a photo. And so like at that time, people's relationship to photography was really different. And also I think they were willing to believe more, because again, like if you think about like when photography was invented and all of a sudden now you can like hold this image, I think people would just, we hadn't reached kind of the boundaries or definitions of what was possible with photography. And so it was easier to believe that you could take a picture of a fairy. But they're really, I mean, they're beautiful photos regardless of whether they're fake or not. And I think that's like another thing when we think about spirit photography or spiritualism in general, is like how much we're willing to suspend our disbelief, and how much of that like kind of liminal space comes in to both photography and spiritualism, of like this in between, being okay with like not having a solid answer or proof of whether it's real or not. I think there was an article that came out recently about the Coddington fairies. So if you Google it, you can get more info about his role in it and kind of like how it was faked. If you want more kind of like hard facts about that, based off of what I could remember, that was it.
Yeah, wonderful. We have someone is asking if you could show the picture of the photo studio with all of the cameras. It was before the seance chart photo.
Yeah, T.G. Hamilton's. The chart, or this one?
Yeah, I think so. If not, let us know. And then here's another question. Do you have any other subjects you like to photograph besides the fake spirit photos?
Oh, I do work with sigils, and kind of like the idea of like a photo as protection. And sigils are where you take a sentence of something that you want to happen. So you can be like, I desire pizza. And then you take out all of the vowels and repeating letters, and then you create a design out of that. So I've been working sigils into my photos, and kind of using the photo itself as a spell. And for a while I was taking pictures of like different divination techniques, how we try to like influence our understanding of what the future will be. I did take a picture that I do think has a spirit in it. I don't have a scan of it, but when I looked closely at it, there was something kind of weird in it that looked like a little face. I wasn't doing anything that day that was spirity. I didn't ask any spirits to come. So it is interesting to think about, like, when any of us are photographing, if we wanted to get a spirit photo, just be like, if there is a spirit or an ancestor or whatever that you feel close to, just being like, hey, grandma, come and sit in this photo, and like maybe see what happens.
We have some just other comments, lots of thank yous, and that it was interested and they really enjoyed it. Someone also already ordered the seance book on the Future website, so that is great. Someone else is also saying that, yeah, how much are we just willing to accept the beauty of things like that fairy photo without needing truth?
Yeah.
And another comment here that 1997 movie Fairy Tale: A True Story is about the fairy phenomenon.
Yes, thank you for reminding me about that. Yes, it's about the fairy, Cottingley fairies.
Yeah, and then one last question here, if you guys send more, and that's okay, but the last one I have here is, would aura photography fall into spirit photography, or is it a completely different category?
I guess it's how you want to define spirit photography. I think that it does, but it's all, I mean, like, you know, I feel like it's kind of how we define it. And even now, like, what is spirit photography? Is orb photography spirit photography? Is how is like spirit photography falling into digital photography? There are definitely like people that are working with spirits and technology. But I feel like aura photography, like the idea that we're photographing our essence or our aura, in some ways is taking a picture of our own spirit. Traditionally, spirit photography's definition was taking pictures of spirits who have passed or trying to make contact with the other side. But we are also spirits, if you believe that, in a body. And so I think that aura photography could fall under the umbrella of spirit photography.
Yeah. I think that might be all of them. I'm gonna turn on my video here and say some closing remarks and give us some time to see if anybody else asks a question. But thank you for joining us. I thought this was really fun. I enjoyed it. It's fun to be in a theme and talk about some spooky things this month, even if it wasn't scary. It's still fun. If you guys want to learn more about what she does, definitely check out her stuff. And if you want to listen to other history webinars, make sure you check out our website or go onto Facebook for ours. Once you click out of here, there should be another tab that pops up that does a really quick little quiz or survey. So if you want to fill that out, that's great. Just gives us an idea of where you all come from and if you liked it and what you'd like to see in the future. Here it says, if you're an audio person, season 2 of the podcast called Unobscured Talks about spiritualism discusses the Fox sisters, Civil War, spirit photography, etc. So that is a good recommendation. It's called Obscured Talks about Spiritualism. So
unobscured. Okay. Thank you for that tip. I always love listening in on more spirit stuff.
Yeah. So we're not getting any more questions, but lots of thank yous and that everyone enjoyed it. So thanks so much. It was great to see all those lovely photos.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. And thanks for everyone who's here and asked questions and is interested.
Yeah. So everyone that is here in Minnesota, stay warm. We have snow already. So we're enjoying that and lots of thank yous coming in. So that's great. We hope to see you again in a webinar like this, and hopefully you can follow more of Lacey's work. It looks great. So thank you everyone and have a good evening.
Thanks so much.
Bye.